Times Radio YouTube channel. Have we thrown the big switch? Somebody's going to turn the cameras on in a minute. Go online to the Times Radio YouTube channel. You can watch along as you do PMQs Unpacked in just a moment. But first, what are MPs actually up to these days? The Spectator's Isabel Hardman has been trying to find out what MPs do to fill their days, because there's not a lot of legislation to discuss. We'll speak to Isabel in just a moment. But first, this was Labour's shadow leader of the House of Commons, Thangan Debonair, complaining last week about the lack of parliamentary business.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, it was incredibly frustrating to see this worn-out Tory government shut up shop and clear out of here before 2 o'clock on Tuesday. Yeah. The House has regularly risen early for months because of thin government business, at least down this end. Never mind up that end where they seem to be clogged up. How are Tory ministers spending their time? Because they're clearly not delivering in their departments. Are they racing home to watch daytime TV instead?
So Thangan Debonair there. So, Isabel Hardman, what are they doing?
Well, my investigative journalism reveals that some of them have been booking sessions with their personal trainers during Prime Minister's questions. Now, for those who aren't sad Westminster hermits like me, the idea that you'd suggest seeing someone during PMQs is like a taboo. I mean, it's the sort of thing that you'd catch somebody new to Westminster out with, saying, oh, let's have lunch at 12 p.m. on a Wednesday. But actually, MPs are so bored that they're trying to find something to do off the estate to keep themselves busy. And as you and I know, Matt, being an MP is a really unhealthy life, so they must be really bored. And actually,
it's interesting because for the last few weeks, it has been sort of notably quieter. You can see quite a lot of the green benches at PMQs.
Yeah.
But even MPs are turning away from it.
Yeah. I mean, there are always MPs who think it's a pointless session, but it goes much wider than PMQs, which is supposed to sort of warm up the two political teams and get them behind their leaders. But as that clip from Thangan Debonair showed, there's not much going on in the chamber generally. There's not very much legislation for MPs to debate. Ministers are almost hoping to be asked urgent questions because it gives them something to do and it gives the Speaker a bit more time to sort of pad out time in the chamber, and they are going home early. And this is partly because we're heading for a general election in the next year, and you always sort of start to wind down the agenda in advance of that. But it's also because Rishi Sunak doesn't really have very much that he can put before MPs that he knows will pass.
He's also not a big sort of, maybe it's just because of the nature of how he came into Commons, but he's not a big sort of reforming. He doesn't feel like a big sort of big ideas. I want to change the way the schools are run, or smash the NHS up. It's very, his 5 priorities are quite sort of. They're very economic, but also like a bit nitpicky.
Yeah, and if you look at the legislation around those 5 priorities, so the illegal migration bill, for instance, which is supposed to stop the boats, it's debatable as to whether that is going to stop the boats or whether it's more of a talking point bill, which is much better for party unity than it is for policy making. But there are things that he would be minded to do if he had the space, such as planning reform, for instance. You're not going to get a planning reform bill. Maybe the thing that he's most passionate about, maths. Maybe we're going to get a maths bill. To keep MPs busy.
Well, he's re-announced that several times, doesn't he?
He does at the start of every term, doesn't he? Yeah, depressingly.
like a headmaster does. I'm going to re-announce the start of the term a new
regime
focus on maths.
Yeah.
Lots of you already get online on the YouTube channel at morning if you are watching. Hello from Northolt, says Martin. Hello from Sherwood Forest, says John. Candy is in upstate New York. Terry's in Liverpool. Morning from London, sunny Sleaford. Bucks, Uckfield, hi Jonathan. Dave, hello from the University of Birmingham Library, where I should be working on my dissertation. I'm sure we can help with that, Dave. Hi from Taunton, says Stephen. Hello from Fleet, says Richard. Hello, Fleet. What do you think might come up today then? What will Keir Starmer choose? I mean, is it just Tory chaos?
I think it could have a strong flavour of Tory chaos, but tying it into what's happening in the country while the Tories disappear into their own belly buttons, basically. So the mortgage chaos is really what Labour wants to talk a lot about. They had an urgent question on that yesterday, and this is something that Conservative MPs who aren't talking about Boris Johnson, who are indeed desperate to talk about anything other than Boris Johnson, are actually quite worried about.
Tim Shipman's arrived. How are you?
Very good, yes. Very fetching short-sleeve shirt you've got on there.
It's not short. I've just rolled my sleeves up.
We'll see.
Just rolling up, getting on with the job, Tim. Same as you.
Very David Cameron.
Yeah, David Cameron visiting a hospital.
Yes.
Tuck your tie in.
Yeah.
We've got some news on the by-elections. They've moved the writs for the by-elections for Nigel Adams and Boris Johnson, but not Nadine Dorries. What's going on, Tim?
She's clinging on. Having decided to resign in a fit of pique to force a by-election to upset them, she's now realised that the way to upset them is to sit around and not allow them to have 3 by-elections at the same time and potentially string it out a bit longer, and then they might have 2 days of bad news instead of 1.
It's an odd way to ingratiate yourself to Conservatives. I mean, I know that she doesn't get on with Rishi Sunak. We know that. But even people sympathetic to her and to Boris Johnson must think this is a really terrible way to go out, isn't it?
It's not great. And I think there are some those who are sympathetic with Nadine Dorries kind of think, the classy thing for Rishi Sunak to do, frankly, would have been to just give her a peerage in due course, even if he couldn't promise one. There might have been a way of finding someone to go and have a quiet word. That looks less likely now than it would have done. Politicians are interesting. There's loads of different politicians. There's lots of people that the public love who are absolute swines in private. And then there's people like Nadine Dorries who have an appalling public reputation because she's always being rude about various people. In private, she's absolutely lovely.
Yeah, she is. Yeah. I think she's also one of those people who actually you can avoid upsetting if you're not dismissive of her, which I think is what has happened in this instance, that she feels as though she's been looked down upon by somebody.
Isn't the truth that Boris Johnson was told she's not going to get a peerage and he just he couldn't bring himself to tell her?
I mean, what a surprise that would be, that he hadn't been entirely straight with somebody.
It seems very unlikely. Right, stay tuned. We are live on Times Radio and live on the Times Radio YouTube channel. PMQs Unpacked is next.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
It's 12 o'clock. I'm Matt Chorley. This is Times Radio. PMQs Unpacked is next. First, a quick look at the headlines this lunchtime. The third victim of the Nottingham attack yesterday has been named as Ian Coates. He was in his 60s and a school caretaker. It's believed his van was stolen to then be driven at 3 other people who were injured. ITV's boss has told MPs if there was solid evidence of a relationship between Philip Schofield and a younger colleague, it would have been properly investigated. Dame Carolyn McCall said the broadcaster does not recognise allegations of a toxic culture at This Morning. Train drivers have voted to approve another 6 months' worth of strikes. The ASLEF union has approved the further action. And Vodafone and the company behind 3 have officially merged, creating the UK's largest mobile phone operator. The deal with CK Hutchison has been accepted for some time. Vodafone will own 51% of the group. We'll have a full news and sport roundup at past. But now live on Times Radio and on the Times Radio YouTube channel. It's time for this.
PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. Unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley and Tim Shipman.
And Tim Shipman's here. Afternoon, Tim.
Good afternoon.
Now, the last time you were here, because you weren't here last week, because it was Deputies Week last week. The last time you were here, we had a bet that Keir Starmer would definitely mention Boris Johnson during PMQs.
Are we going double or quits today?
Well, I just wondered that because he didn't mention Boris Johnson at all, so you now owe me a dinner.
Yes.
Do you think he'll mention Boris Johnson this week?
I will bet you 2 dinners against no dinners.
That you think it's...
I mean, I would...
It's nailed on, isn't it?
It's
To be
pretty
clear,
nailed
that other dinner is being banked. I've won that. You can't take that away from me.
Oh, right. Oh.
Yeah. We're also joined in the studio by Isabel Hardman from Spectator. Isabel,
It's not like Bullseye then, is it? Where,
No.
you lost the...
No,
You know,
the caravan is mine.
The caravan.
Isabel, hello.
Hello, are you going to get both dinners in one evening? Is that the plan?
Yeah, we'll go full, just really rinse Tim's...
Start with the
Gattin.
5 guys and then move on.
Isabel, what do you think? Will Keir Starmer go big on Boris Johnson and Nadine Dorries and all of that? Or will he try to rise above it and talk policy?
I suspect that he will weave it into his jokes, but allow Labour backbenchers to continue the attack throughout the session.
I'm just looking at the pictures of the House of Commons. Rishi Sunak's got Chloe Smith on one side. I think the Oliver Dowden was there. No obvious sign of Nadine Dorries in the House of Commons. despite the news that she's announced she wants to stay on a bit longer. She's not going to trigger a by-election just yet. What sort of reception do you think she'd get if she did turn up in the House of Commons from her colleagues as well?
I mean, some of her colleagues really don't like her and are annoyed by the psychodrama that she and Boris Johnson are wreaking upon the party. But she does have lots of very close friends who are MPs across the House, actually, who are very fond of her as a person. So I don't think it would be like, for instance, Matt Hancock, who gets glared at whenever he comes into the Commons now.
Well, he's now a normal person again, isn't he?
In touch with the people.
He's wearing jeans.
I think up to a point, Lord Copper.
If you were advising Keir Starmer, what do you think he should go on, if not just Boris?
Well, there's a lot of economic
banter?
stuff going on as well, and mortgages soaring, and, is the economy really picking up? But I think what Starmer's done in the past with this kind of stuff is to say this wicked psychodrama is distracting attention from the important things that the British public wants to talk about. So obviously the best way to not distract attention is to spend half an hour talking about it on a Wednesday lunchtime. But, I mean, it would surprise me if this wasn't a decent wedge of it, to be honest.
Because
Because it is still a running story,
Yes.
and as we always talk about, the way for the leader of the opposition to, inject themselves into the news agenda is to start talking about what's actually in the news, and this is.
And Keir Starmer's his early success as leader of the opposition was going up against Boris Johnson. 12 months ago, that was the big turning point. So
and does Starmer even need to get a sort of win on this? If he gets Rishi Sunak talking about it, that will keep the story going, which will wind up Boris Johnson's people again, which will mean that there's more drama and more counter briefing, and that will keep it flowing in the papers for another 24 hours. So
it's interesting.
It's not. He doesn't even need to win an argument.
It's probably the one time where the leader of the opposition isn't bothered about getting into the bulletins, just getting Rishi Sunak back in the bulletins, being rude about Boris Johnson, which means that one of his ermine-clad friends can brief again against him, and then it just all rolls on.
And it's been interesting that Rishi Sunak has risen to the bait in the past few days in the way that he hasn't really over his tenure as Prime Minister and prior to that. He's always tried to be quite detached, as though he's sort of watching things going on from a distance. Whereas on Monday, he really confronted the question of what Boris Johnson had asked him, and it poked the bear, didn't it? Because then Boris got really angry. So I'll be really interested to see how ready the Prime Minister is to go into any further details, or whether he's going to try again to sort of appear more like a kind of blogger rather than a Prime Minister. Yeah,
that line about if people don't like it, tough, just clearly set them all off.
I mean, not since Ed Miliband was talking about
am I tough enough?
Tough enough.
Tough enough. Right, here we go then. We are going live to the House of Commons. After PMQs, there is going to be a statement from the Home Secretary, Sunak Hardman, on the incident in Nottingham. But I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up as well. But let's go live to the House of Commons. And this is question number 1 from Keir Starmer.
Of the opposition, Keir Starmer.
I join with the Prime Minister in his comments about the terrible attack in Nottingham yesterday, and in tribute to the work of our emergency services. The thoughts of the whole House are with the victims and the people of that great city. I also join him in remembering the 72 people who lost their lives in the Grenfell Tower fire. The victims and their families are always in our hearts, but 6 years on, the justice they're fighting for is long overdue. Mr. Speaker, all across the country, people are worried about their bills, the price of the weekly shop, and the spiralling mortgage rates. So why has the Tory party spent this last week arguing over which of them gets a peerage?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my points on this are very clear. In line with a long-established convention of previous Prime Ministers having the ability to submit honours, I followed the process to the letter in convention with long-standing process. It is, by the way, Mr. Speaker, a long-standing convention that Prime Ministers on both sides of this House have followed in the same way that I did.
Keir Starmer.
Oh, dear. He's fallen into the trap there, hasn't he?
Well, he sort of answered a question he wasn't asked.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's not unheard of at PMQs, but it's sort of slightly odd to sort of launch into a defence of his behaviour.
Why not say, actually, we are addressing the cost of living crisis
Correct.
and launch into a thing on...
Yes, this is what I've been doing.
Halving
All I
inflation.
did on that peerage thing was just say, great, this has landed on my desk, off you go. I've actually spent, you know, how many meetings I've had this day, the day before. You know, I mean, you could have made a real kind of...
Yeah.
We could have had a real master's list of how hard he's been working on all these vital issues.
Tackling the big issues.
Yeah, although I can see that he might think, preparing for the session, look, let's try and hit this on the nose, get it sorted early. But I don't think that statement really does close things off. If you're going to have a kind of crisis comms approach where you get everything out there, don't have a short statement that doesn't get everything out there and that allows many, many follow-up questions.
Well, there we are. And I think, you know, like they're trying to say, well, we've all done it. Your lot have done it. I've done it. We've all done it. It's a long-standing convention. I'm not sure
Gordon Brown didn't do it, of course.
No. But he had a dissolution on his list.
He did, which was quite convenient for him.
Yes. I think there's also a long-standing convention of prime ministers not being shameless, and I think if you've got a Boris Johnson convention breaker, then you might expect his successor but one to break some conventions to deal with that as well.
Yeah. Right, very good. Let's see if this gets any better. Question number 2 from Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the truth is, for all his tough talk after the event, the Prime Minister did sign off the honours list. And that means, Mr. Speaker, that those who threw a Downing Street party the night before the late Queen sat alone at her husband's funeral will now receive awards from the King. If he's so tough, why didn't he block it?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, I and the government follow due process and convention. Prime ministers of both parties have always upheld the convention of non-interference on political honours. My predecessors may not have agreed with Labour's choices of Tom Watson or Shami Chakrabarti, but the same precedent, Mr. Speaker, the same precedent stood then as it does now, and I'd expect a knight like him to understand that.
Oh, no, okay, this is better. This is much better. Well done, everybody. Interesting that Keir Starmer's position, Isabel, is to attack the people who are on the list. We're not even into yet Boris Johnson and Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams.
Yep.
But to say you shouldn't have even approved the others.
Yeah,
because they broke the lockdown rules.
Yeah, and this is his way of keeping it alive, following the exit of Boris Johnson. Although the idea that Boris Johnson is going to disappear off into the ether is nonsense. But I thought that Rishi Sunak's... I mean, he's obviously now on the attack as his defence. But to then say, you know, we're basically as bad as you are... I mean, I find this really depressing in politics. We had this with anti-Semitism, didn't we? Labour would hit back saying, but you're Islamophobic. And it's like, we're just as bad as you are. Really isn't that inspiring in politics, is it?
And Sunak could have distanced himself there. He could have been a little blunter and said, well, I wouldn't have put those people on the list, but the convention is that the list is nodded through and, you know, yada, yada, yada. But he didn't do that. But Yen, you know...
Tom Watson.
Always
good to chuck Tom Watson on the table.
Always worth a mention.
Which pedo hunter-in-chief, Tom Watson, self-appointed.
And Shami Whitewash Chakrabarti as well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone found either of those appointments particularly edifying at the time. And then to cap it all, a joke about his knighthood.
Keir Starmer's got a knighthood.
And we've had this conversation before, but it always bears repetition, that in the focus groups, a very large number of people think that Keir Starmer has a knighthood because he's posh, not because he was the Director of Public Prosecutions and did a important job. And now we can all argue about whether people who do important jobs should get honours just for doing their jobs, but he did. And but the Tories put Sir Keir Starmer in every single press release they ever put out. Every time they mention him, they call him Sir Keir. And it has a little bit of an effect in the focus groups, and that was a sort of...
Well, because it all gets rolled up into sort of out of touch. He doesn't understand us, despite him having a sort of perfectly normal upbringing, famously with a father as a toolmaker and a mother as a nurse.
Which shows actually why you need to be so repetitive in politics. Because even though we can recite Keir Starmer's life story, you know, the donkeys and how long each donkey lived almost, actually voters haven't noticed any of that yet because they have actual lives to get on with, which is astonishing.
Yeah. And also, it's also because it's slightly...
Well, I'm off anyway.
Please not have another speech about how his father was a toolmaker. Anyway, this is livened up a bit.
Toolmaker is the new bus driver, isn't it?
Yeah,
essentially.
Son of a toolmaker, son of a bus driver. Right, let us know what you think. You can post your comments on the Times Radio YouTube channel. Andy's saying Rishi's going to try and tough this one out. Should be interesting. Bet Starmer just asked his next scripted question anyway. Says, well, that is the slight risk of what's going on here. Anyway, let's go back to the House of Commons. So this is question number 3 from Keir Starmer.
I think we will.
I know it's Lindsay Hoyle.
I think we will have more if we carry on. It'll be more outside rather than here. Keir Starmer.
Honour should be for public service, not Tory cronies. But, Mr. Speaker, isn't this the case? He was too weak to block Johnson's list. And that also means that those who spent their time helping cover up Johnson's law-breaking are rewarded by becoming lawmakers for the rest of their lives. Is his message to the British public, if you don't like it, tough?
Mr. Speaker, it's right that we use the honour system to recognise people. Almost 2,000 people a year, from members of the England Lionesses team to the first Asian police officer in Greater Manchester. But he talks about putting people in the House of Lords. Perhaps he could explain why he put forward for a peerage the former MP, Labour MP Tom Watson, who spread vicious conspiracy theories that were totally and utterly untrue, damaged public discourse and inflicted misery on innocent people.
Can I?
Oh.
Quiet. Can I just say to the Prime Minister? He shouldn't criticise other members. Also, you're not responsible for the other parties. You are the Prime Minister that's answering the questions, not asking the questions. Here's some.
That's quite ballsy by Lindsay Hoyle, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you get this now and again. And I don't know. I think sometimes Prime Ministers spend a lot of time asking questions. It felt to me that was a reasonable response under the circumstances from Sunak. I'm not quite sure why Hoyle got his knickers in that particular twist.
So just reminded that Tom Watson was heavily criticised for his support for false claims of a Westminster paedophile ring by the fantasist Carl Beach. He was put forward to the House of Lords. Was it actually by Jeremy Corbyn and then sort of nodded through by Keir Starmer? Because it was long delayed, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was part of the deal for Tom Watson leaving as deputy leader and leaving as an MP as well.
Yeah.
So, but I think one thing that does give Starmer a little bit of stronger ground on this is that he is actually in favour of abolishing the House of Lords. Now, no one around him actually thinks it's going to happen. Everyone who's actually looked into how it would work in terms of getting this reform through Parliament has said it ain't going to happen. It's one of those silly pledges you make as leader of the opposition. But at least he's sort of committed to getting rid of the whole lot and saying, you know, it doesn't work. This appointment system is manifestly wrong.
Yeah. But it's interesting that they've obviously, you know, in the briefing this morning, the PMQs prep, they've also decided to go on the attack on Tom Watson rather than try and move the conversation on to him.
Yeah, I mean, they feel that this is worth having a crack on.
Yeah.
I find the whole thing slightly leaves me cold. But as soon as we get into debates about the future of the House of Lords, the only person you need to call is Jack Straw, who spent about 3 years trying to accomplish this. And
they voted
at
against
the end
every
of
single option.
Every time you talk to him now about it, he'll just sort of say, no, it's just not worth it.
Yeah. Right, very good. We go back to the House of Commons then. We are now on question number 4 from Keir Starmer.
Order.
More Lindsay Hoyle.
Is somebody wanting to challenge my decision? Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the truth is the country is paying the price of this endless cycle of chaos and distraction. The Tory economic crash means that millions of mortgage holders will pay thousands of pounds more next year. And the blame lies squarely at the door of a government more focused on the internal wars of the Tory party than the needs of the country. Does he not think that those responsible should hang their heads in shame?
Mr. Speaker, as I said right at the beginning of the session, our number one economic priority is to reduce inflation so that we can restrain the increase in interest rates. But one thing we know that we need to do that is to reduce our borrowing and debt, Mr. Speaker. That's how we will bring interest and mortgage rates down. But last week, what did we see? Labour confusion with the Shadow Chancellor attempting to water down their plans to borrow £28 billion more a year. But she was promptly overruled by the Shadow Energy Secretary, the former leader, who said that they were 100% not abandoning their pledge. It really looks like Labour's offer never changes. It's uncontrolled borrowing and more chaos with Ed Miliband.
Chaos with Ed Miliband.
Well, that's very good. A bit of chutzpah there.
Yeah.
Those of you not understanding why we're all cackling like wild geese.
Thanks so much.
David Cameron, of course, did a tweet back in 2015 saying, you could have, this sensible, dull Tory party or chaos with Ed Miliband and whatever coalition he'd put together. It's sort of one of the hollowest tweets ever.
Britain faces an inescapable choice.
That's the fella.
Stability and strong government with me or chaos with Ed Miliband. May the 4th, 2015.
I mean, to be fair, there might have been chaos with Ed Miliband, but good Lord, they've given us some chaos of their own, haven't they?
I feel like chaos with Ed Miliband has become a bit like the Killer's Mr. Brightside that gets played at the end of every single nightclub evening. It's just a song that's just going to keep coming back, and that the older ones amongst us are all going to go, oh my goodness, every time it's played.
I'm afraid Mr. Brightside gets me up yeah.
I beg your pardon.
Like nothing.
Straight on the dance.
Oh, straight on the dance floor. Okay. I don't know where that was going.
This is a family show, Tim.
Oh my goodness me. But no, interesting point on the 28 billion. Labour had, that's a pretty big U-turn by the Labour Party last week. They pledged 28 billion of extra spending on green energy. Rachel Reeves has had to say the economy is in a worse state than we thought, and that has to be punted to the second half of the next Parliament. Ed Miliband busily tweeting saying we haven't abandoned the pledge, but they've certainly delayed it. In a more propitious environment, that's something that Sunak could have had quite a lot of fun with, but he's on the back foot in general. And interestingly, we're now on to sort of more of the economic material that we were expecting. Where's Rishi Sunak boasting about the latest, thing from the IMF or whoever saying, look how well you're doing, Britain.
And the economy grew today.
It grew, yes. Yeah. But
interestingly,
they're not soaring ahead,
on the question of who is to blame for interest rates going up, YouGov did some polling on this, and they said interest rates will be predicted to rise between 5 and 5.5% this year. Who or what do you think is most to blame? 32% said the government's economic policies, well ahead of all the others. 16-70% said Russia, COVID, Brexit, and don't know. But, I mean, actually, to me, you could possibly even lump Brexit actually into... I mean, that's ultimately within the government's gift. So, yeah, that's obviously landing with voters. Almost half of Labour voters blaming the government directly for what's happening to their mortgages. It's got a bad place to be, isn't it?
It is, and it's also this gamble that a lot of Tories have been putting their faith in, really, that by the next election... voters will start to see, green shoots in the economy, as politicians always call it, and they'll start to think things are getting better. Let's stick with these guys who probably, on balance, are still better than, chaos with Sir Keir and Ed Miliband. But actually, if you're really feeling it in terms of, mortgage chaos or the mortgage penalty, as Labour now want to call it, then you're not going to thank the government, you're not going to trust the government, and you're going to think, well, these guys can't be any worse, can they? In fact, they've been scaling back on some of Ed Miliband's chaos.
But for landing that mortgage penalty just doesn't work, does it? It needs to be mortgage bombshell or mortgage... Yeah. It's a little bit technocratic.
Mortgage penalty sounds like a letter you'd get from HMRC, doesn't it? Which,
Yeah, I agree it's a bit arcane, but I also agree with Isabel that I think, just as likely as people saying, oh, thanks very much, government, you finally sorted out the economy, is it might take away a bit of the sort of Tory argument that can you really, we're just getting back, do you really want to risk it with Labour? Some people might think, oh, well, actually, we look like we're sort of in okay shape now. Why don't we let these people who'd actually like to sort out some of these public services
well done.
have a go as well?
You've cleared up the mess that you created.
Yes.
Now clear off.
Now let these people
rather
have
than
a go.
We're going to thank you for repairing some of the damage that you made is a difficult,
It's a bit like parents letting their children have a weekend at home a few weeks after trashing the house with a party. Sort of, we trust you again.
Yeah, we'll definitely trust you again to not do that again.
Yeah.
And the problem Sunak's got, of course, is he's not responsible for most of the trashing. We're still living in the post-Liz Truss world here, aren't we? That's what really tanked the Tory poll rating, and it's what really tanked the economy. And he's sort of, there's a slight feel of Ken Clarke, Chancellor of the Exchequer, about all this, that they sort of Tories grind away miserably for a year and a half and finally get everything sort of looking okay again, and then the public says, thanks very much, off you pop.
Well, I remember at one point, the depth of all the awfulness last year, Charles Walker, the Tory MP, told me that it was the responsibility of the Tory party now was to get the country in the best shape possible before handing it over. It was an extraordinary thing for Tory society.
And that is something that a lot of Tory MPs say about the party as well, is that they trust Rishi Sunak to clear things up to the extent that the party doesn't completely collapse after losing the next election. And many of them are thinking about what could happen to it in opposition, as happened with Labour after its 2015 defeat, that it just went into this period of horrendous denial. A lot of Tory MPs want Sunak to sharpen things up, sufficient that they feel like a fighting force, as opposed to a party that can go into a sort of indulgent Liz Truss think tank era.
Yeah.
And it will depend on the result, frankly. If it's reasonably close, you can expect sort of incremental changes. If there's a wipeout for Labour, I don't know many Tories who don't think that there'll be a dramatic lurch to the right and something resembling the Ian Duncan-Smith leadership following thereon. As Isabel says, the big battle is to try and stop that from happening. With a 10% chance of sneaking over the line, in their back pocket.
Well, let's see. I thought we would got on question number 6, but isn't it? It's question number 5. Let's go back to the House of Commons. It's Keir Starmer.
There's only one party. There's only one party that broke the economy. They're sitting right there. And there's a reason. There's a reason they can't fix the problems facing the country, because they never take responsibility for the damage that they've done. And it's not just Johnson. The Prime Minister's immediate predecessor is hoping to reward those who made her reign such a rip-roaring success. On her honours list are the masterminds of that kamikaze budget, the economic extremists of the Institute of Economic Affairs, those whose disastrous ideas crashed the economy and left the country to pick up the pieces. Will the Prime Minister block that honours list, or will he buckle to her as well?
Mr. Speaker, if you want disastrous economic ideas, all you have to do is Labour's economic policy on energy. It's an energy policy that seeks to ban all new British oil and gas drilling, Mr. Speaker, jeopardising 200,000 jobs and our energy security at a time of international conflict. Despots like Putin are the only people who will welcome such a policy. His predecessor once said that he wanted British jobs for British workers. His policy is British jobs for Russian workers.
It's bravura.
It's something.
It's curious.
Interesting, quite smart. Let's do the question first, and we'll try to work out what that answer was about. The question, not bad, really. Will you now block Liz Truss's? It's interesting, he said Johnson in the House of Commons, which is technically against the rules, but he got away with it.
Is that because he's no longer an MP?
Oh, you're right. Yes, he probably can now.
Yeah,
he doesn't have to refer to the right honourable member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip.
He can just call him. But
he's whatever he is, the Baron of the Manor of Northolt. Or all the other.
The Chiltern Hundreds.
Oh, he's Chiltern Hundreds.
No, he's Chiltern Hundreds.
He was Manor of Northstead last time.
He's just got the full set.
It's nice that he's had both.
He's got them both.
Yeah.
Calling for Rishi Sunak to block Liz Truss's honours list, because if normal members of the public think that Boris Johnson's list is a bit much, Liz Truss putting people in the House of Lords on the basis of 44 disastrous days in charge is quite something.
It's also quite something to envisage Rishi Sunak being too weak to block Liz Truss, which, Boris Johnson is this sort of force.
Yeah.
Liz Truss was, famously beaten by a lettuce, and I think is sort of now seen as a laughing stock by most of the British public. So the idea that she would be somebody who would frighten Rishi Sunak is quite comedic, really.
If you've ever seen both of them in action, I think she'd she'd do him good and proper if it ever came to a fist fight.
What, Rishi and Liz?
Yeah. Don't you think?
Yeah, if it came to an actual fist fight, I think she'd win.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure.
Definitely.
Maybe they should just take it to a pub car park and just whoever emerges gets
Can't
an
you do
get
it
an
as an
honours list.
item
Yeah.
on your
If they want to
show?
come on, Liz, if you're listening. I met a young chap the other night. I was out in a bar and I was chatting to someone. And somebody mentioned Rishi Sunak. And this guy turned around and said, "Oh, what do you think of Rishi?" And he went, "Oh, no. Anyway, basically, it turned out he worked for Liz Truss. And he was obviously just out doing like focus groups to ask what we thought about Liz Truss.
I suppose he's got plenty of time to be in a bar if he works for Liz Truss as well.
And he probably does dive you to drink. Right, let's go back to the House of Commons. Then question
We never
number
talked about the answer.
Oh, sorry, we ought to talk about the answer. British jobs for Russian workers.
Well, I mean, the point about this energy policy, which I think even a lot of Labour people think is a little bit odd, that you know, because if we don't create our own energy, we'll probably be buying it from somewhere else.
Yeah.
I'm not sure British jobs for Russian workers quite sums that up in the way they hoped.
Well, because the argument is that the argument against what they're suggesting is you stop all new North Sea oil and gas.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't have any British jobs there.
Well, quite.
It'd be Russian jobs for Russian workers if we were importing their oil and gas.
But equally, the whole point of energy security is that we're not buying it from Russia. So more accurately, it would be Norwegian jobs for Norwegian workers.
Yeah.
I think is actually
because the Labour argument would be we're going to spend all this money, but what we're going to do is invest in alternatives to North Sea oil and gas, so we don't need that anymore. And that's why we have a deadline to get rid of it.
But if you talk to Scottish Labour, which I spend quite a lot of time doing when I'm up in Holyrood, they are really worried about their voters who do not think that the high-tech green jobs of the future are ones they have skills for. So if you talk to anyone who sort of represents people in Aberdeen, those constituents do not think that renewable energy is something they're going to be able to transfer into. And that's what Sunak should be scaring people with, is the prospect that the job that their city has been built on is just going to disappear, and it is not going to be replaced like for like.
And we've seen that with other industries before, haven't we?
Yeah.
With tin and coal and all the rest of it. And in some of these places, they've become hubs for cars or new tech or whatever. But in some of them, they're still recovering now, 30 years on.
Right, now we've analysed that. Let's go back to question number 6 from Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if he spent as much time focused on the economy, the NHS and the asylum system as he does haggling with his predecessors about who gets honours, the country would be in a far better state. But once again, he's lost control, and once again, it's working people paying the price. And if he disagrees with that, why not put it to the test? End the boasting, the excuses, the Tory chaos. See if he can finally find somebody, anybody, anywhere to vote for him and call a general election now.
Mr. Speaker, he talked about asylum just this week. It was the Labour Party that voted against plans to tackle illegal migration. Just this week, it was the Labour Party that voted against plans to tackle disruptive protesters by their funding eco-zealots, Mr. Speaker. But we're getting on and delivering for the country. We're delivering record employment and the fastest wage growth in years, Mr. Speaker. It's clear only the Conservatives are going to deliver for the people of Britain.
Well, there we are.
Yeah, I mean,
he warmed up, didn't he?
He warmed up. I mean, it's quite hard to score it anything other than 6-0. Do we give him half a point for effort at the end? I mean, maybe. Though I'm intrigued that Starmer has now leapt on the let's have a general election thing quite this early.
Yeah.
Because it's...
I noticed we had one of the monthly Sunday Mirror front pages.
Yes.
General election now. If all else fails, general election now.
Yeah, and, during the May years when she had no majority and, there was quite a decent case for it, even then they only kind of got towards... Corbyn's lot only started really hammering that in the final few months. And, you can wait quite a long time not getting a general election whilst demanding one. Because now that the fixed-term Parliament Act's gone, it's basically up to Rishi Sunak when he has a general election. And I'm somewhat sceptical that he's on the verge of calling one.
Well, I suppose it does work, Isabel, to sort of wind up voters, to aggravate for change.
Yeah.
Boris Johnson's gone. let's kick the rest of them out. To sort of fuel that.
Sort of why are you still here?
The call for change.
Yeah, and do you remember in the days after the 2010 result when Gordon Brown was still in Downing Street while all the coalition...
The squatter.
Yeah, the squatter narrative. I wonder whether you could apply that to an entire government rather than just a Prime Minister who was, had been defeated and was clapped out.
Yeah.
Whether, because the government as a whole looks clapped out, Labour would have some effect in campaigning for that. But I mean, I agree with Tim. If you keep calling for things, it's like the call that you make as a politician when you say that somebody needs to resign.
Yeah.
You need to have a reasonable hope that they're going to do that. Otherwise, you just look like you're a sort of... I mean, there are some MPs who call for people to resign as soon as they're appointed, and you just start to look a bit incredible.
Yeah, I mean,
a lot of it
Labour usually call for people to resign, and the Lib Dems normally call for Parliament to be recalled in all circumstances.
We call for Cobra meetings.
Yeah,
Yes.
There's also a question of where the public are on this. If Labour's polling is showing people just want an election now, and you're on their side, then fine. But if the public is saying, but the last thing we want in the middle of all this is a general election, then you just annoy them by calling for it. And it just depends whether or not you want public opinion. Right, we'll do the best and the rest in just a minute. Patrick Maguire's going to join us for that. Tim Shipman in Isabel, Hardman. Stay where you are. Let's get a news update now from Rachel Jewell.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon. The third victim of the Nottingham attacks has been named as school caretaker Ian Coates. Mr. Coates, who was in his 60s, was found fatally stabbed in the city in the early hours of yesterday and has been described as beloved and respected. Two 19-year-old university students, Grace Kumar and Barnaby Webber, were also killed. A 31-year-old man is being questioned on suspicion of murder. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has asked the Prime Minister why the Conservative Party spent this last week arguing over which of them gets a peerage. He's hit out at the row over Boris Johnson's honours list, but also raised the ongoing issue of interest rates, saying the country's stuck in a cycle of chaos and destruction. Rishi Sunak told Prime Minister's questions he's followed due process.
My points on this are very clear. In line with a long-established convention of previous Prime Ministers having the ability to submit honours, I followed the process to the letter in convention with long-standing process. It is, by the way, Mr. Speaker, a long-standing convention that Prime Ministers on both sides of this House have followed in the same way that I did.
Keir Starmer also told the Commons honours should be for public service, not Tory cronies, and used his last question to call for this.
Why not put it to the test? End the boasting, the excuses, the Tory chaos. See if he can finally find somebody, anybody, anywhere to vote for him and call a general election now.
The Health Secretary says pay demands made by striking junior doctors in England are out of step with the general public. Members of the British Medical Association walked out this morning for 72 hours. And Vodafone and Three are to merge their operations in the UK to create the country's largest mobile operator. Most areas will be dry, very warm and generally sunny this afternoon. However, isolated thunderstorms are possible across northern Scotland. Jeremy Leeburn has the sports.
Real Madrid have completed the signing of England international Jude Bellingham. The 19-year-old moves to the Spanish Giants from Borussia Dortmund in a deal worth up to £115 million. The midfielders agreed a 6-year contract. England wicketkeeper Johnny Bairstow says they can sense the excitement building around the country ahead of the Ashes. He's back in the Test cricket side for the home series after recovering from a broken leg, with the opening match getting underway in Birmingham on Friday. Bairstow insists he's worked hard to return and is confident he'll come back stronger than ever.
It's not about the amount of times you get knocked down, it's about the amount of times you get back up. And it's the bit that, like I say, no one sees are the important bits that stand you in good stead when the chips are down and you're able to front up.
Former Wimbledon semi-finalist Tatiana Maria is calling for an improvement in childcare facilities at WTA tournaments. The German, currently ranked 67 in the world, says it would be nice for the kids to have daycare in more competitions than just the Grand Slams. Meanwhile, this year's Wimbledon singles champions will take home a cheque for £2.35 million. The All England clubs announced a record prize pot for this year, with a first-round exit still earning you a £55,000 payday. And a director at the Alzheimer's Society hopes that Wembley Stadium's new dementia-friendly scheme will help towards the UK and Ireland's Euro 2028 bid. The charity has partnered with the FA to make England's national stadium more accessible for fans with dementia. Paul Reynolds has told Times Radio it would be amazing to have this scheme replicated at an international tournament.
We want to provide help and hope to everyone affected by dementia, and that includes people visiting our country. If the work we do creates a safe space for people living with dementia that can be replicated in, worldwide sporting events, that is absolutely something that would, be amazing.
For more on all these stories, head to the Times website and app.
This is Times Radio.
They might have been your best mate since you were babies. They might be the only one that knows about that thing you did. They might be your boo, your homegirl, your muchacho. But you've just got 6 deliciously crisp chicken McNuggets. So you have to ask yourself, are they McNugget worthy? Served after 11 a.m, subject to availability.
Hope, an optimistic state of mind based on an emotion, a desire for a positive outcome. It's a feeling of trust, but hope for our planet feels more complex than that. I'm Adam Vaughan, the Environment Editor for The Times, and this is Planet Hope, a new podcast from The Times in partnership with Rolex and its Perpetual Planet initiative. In this series, I'll be asking why our planet is changing so rapidly, and we'll seek out the groundbreaking experts from around the world who are trying to fix it. Welcome to Planet Hope. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Protect your devices with one of the UK's most trusted cybersecurity solutions, rated excellent on Trustpilot. ESET Digital Security. Progress protected.
John Pienaar at Drive, this afternoon from 5 on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB Digital Radio, on the free Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Very good afternoon to you. It's Matt Chorley on Times Radio. We've done PMQs Unpacked. Tim Shipman, Sunday Times chief political commentator, still here. Isabel Hardman from the Spectator's here. And now, sort of creating a zoo radio format, Patrick Maguire's here as well, playing the role of Lara Spirit.
Good afternoon. Understudy to... I wouldn't be so impolite as to call Lara Spirit my understudy, but yeah.
There we are.
Understudy to the understudy.
Somebody on the YouTube channel said, I wonder if Patrick knows we're all closely studying his head.
Well, actually, there's a little bald spot there, which is where I had a precancerous mole removed in 2019, on the day Jeremy Corbyn launched his leadership. No, launched his election campaign. There's a tortured metaphor.
Fill in your own joke.
Yeah.
That's also a very good defence against anyone ever being rude about a bald patch.
Yeah.
You can make them feel really bad.
Yeah. Well, there we are. Get on the YouTube channel if you want to see the top of Patrick Maguire's head. Patrick, you've been watching the rest of PMQs so that we don't have to. Who have you picked up?
Well, a bit of a cop-out, as ever, but Stephen Flynn had a very punchy question today, the SNP leader.
Take a listen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to echo the sentiments of the Prime Minister and indeed the Leader of the Opposition in relation to the terrible incident in Nottingham, and indeed our thoughts are with all of those still reeling from the tragedy at Grenfell all these years later. Mr. Speaker, during his ill-fated leadership bid late last summer, the Prime Minister warned of the perils of mortgage rate rises. Indeed, he stated, and I quote, "It's going to tip millions of people into misery, and it's going to mean we have absolutely no chance of winning the next election." Given that mortgage rates continue to rise, does he still agree with his own electoral analysis?
Mr. Speaker, which is absolutely why our economic policy sets as our number one priority to reduce inflation and thereby bring interest rates, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, have also risen in pretty much every developed economy around the world, more so in places like America and New Zealand, similar in other countries as well, like Australia. But it is important, in order to reduce inflation, that you do need to have control over borrowing, Mr. Speaker, which is why we, unlike the party opposite, are disciplined with regard to the public finances. But these are the issues that we should be focused on. I saw that the SNP yesterday, Mr. Speaker, had a meeting to discuss their future, but the only thing they managed to decide was that they should send Nicola Sturgeon some flowers. So can he tell us, did he sign the card?
Stephen Flynn. Mr. Speaker, respectfully, I think the Prime Minister needs to grow up. There is a...
Yeah, I think in that question there you have all of human life is there, obviously, but in a nutshell, I think you have the two perhaps biggest challenges for both of those parties in the next election. One is the economic data we've had over the past couple of days, gilt yields, mortgages being pulled off the market, inflation remaining stubbornly high. That's the economic backdrop. Rishi Sunak, no matter how many things he fixes, as his allies would say, is going to have to be battling into that headwind at the next election. The second thing is, no matter what the SNP say, any party facing them can just point to the bin fire in the camper van fire behind them. Not even a bin fire, the camper van fire behind them. And that is the issue for the SNP trying to prosecute any narrative about anyone else's misfortunes at the minute.
Did I detect there that Lindsay Hoyle slightly laughed at Rishi Sunak's joke about the flowers? But did you notice that, Patty, your old mate Lindsay Hoyle you spoke so highly of last week?
Who treats his office with the reverence it deserves. No, I didn't hear that, actually. Presumably, if he was laughing, he'd make sure he'd laugh really loud so everyone could hear, because he's such a card, Lindsay, isn't he?
Right, once again, those are the views of Patrick Maguire, not of Times Radio. Who else are we going to listen to on the old PMQs?
A very interesting question from the Tory backbencher, Theresa Villiers.
Oh, here we go.
Theresa Villiers.
Really worried about the cost of living. Will the Prime Minister agree that it is completely wrong for Labour to be introducing new ULEZ driving
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this important issue. While we are getting on providing significant support to families with the cost of living, the Labour Mayor of London, to whom transport has devolved, is busily putting it up, imposing the ULEZ charge against the overwhelming views of residents and businesses. It is disappointing he is not listening to the British public and the public in outer London, but what's even more, his plan to raise costs on working families is totally backed by the Leader of the Opposition.
Kim Johnson.
I'm surprised he got away with that, or she got away with it, given that earlier on Lindsay Hoyle ruled out, said that it wasn't for Rishi Sunak to talk about what Labour were doing.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it?
Is that basically, would you like to attack the Labour Mayor of London?
On the day the writ for the Uxbridge by-election is moved, on the day Greg Hands is on the doorstep in Uxbridge, the Tories already put out a video to this effect. They want to make the Uxbridge by-election out of London, one of the Boris he was talking about, a referendum on ULEZ, not a referendum on Boris Johnson or the Tory
Explain
party.
to people outside London what ULEZ is.
It is a £12.50 a day charge if you are driving I'm not a motorist, I might get this wrong, a petrol or diesel car.
A wicked polluting vehicle.
Yeah.
Turns out Lindsay Hoyle's an inconsistent card.
It would be great if he vetted backbench questions for quality, though, wouldn't it? I mean, our lives would become so much more interesting.
Well, that's basically
what John Burko used to do, isn't it? Rubbish, sit
That's
down.
what Patrick does.
That's what Patrick does. Patrick is basically vetting, so we don't have to sit through all of them.
Yeah, but the Tories see this as one of those issues where they can finally have some kind of traction, and it's not just the Uxbridge by-election. You know,
And
they hope they can do it for the mayoral election
some
as well.
big hitting household names in the running.
They've got three
Tory mayoral candidates. Anyone to try and name one of them?
Well, Daniel Korski.
Daniel Korski, of
been
course.
setting the world alight with some very exciting tweets about abolishing traffic lights and things like that.
Yeah.
I think it is going to be really difficult for Labour, though, because if you talk to Labour MPs, even Labour front benchers, who are either in London and affected by this ULEZ, or who have got LTN, these low traffic neighbourhood walls on their doorstep, they all accept that it is something that really ignites local communities and gets people wound up, and is very difficult to defend because it feels like an imposition against people's sense of power and control over their own lives.
We lost a babysitter over ULEZ.
Really?
She won't drive to us anymore because it costs her too much.
Well, there we are. Well, you need to up your rates.
Give her a bite.
Well, don't actually need to save the money for pay for my dinner. Now, talking of things that wind people up, Boris Johnson and his whether or not he lied to Parliament, the Privileges Committee report we thought was going to come out today. There's been delayed in part because they couldn't print it in time. So earlier on, we asked two printing companies to give us a quote for printing a report, 650 times for each MP, 200 journalists. Nice green cover. We reckon about 50 pages. Ellis and Louise are back. Are you both there?
Hiya, how you doing?
Very good. So, Ellis, how quickly could you turn it round and how much would it cost us?
Well, for Boris, I would do that in 48 hours and I would charge him £3,950.
Yeah, very good. And what about you, Louise?
Again, 48 hours and just slightly cheaper, 3,700.
Well, there we are.
It's about a minute of Boris Johnson's pro rata public speaking rate.
You wouldn't even have read out the summary before you'd have covered your costs. But actually, it's interesting what you're making. Even for you, it would take 48 hours to turn it around. So maybe this is justifiable in the House of Commons, Ellis.
I would suspect so. Yeah. I'm sure there's more at play here, perhaps. But, I don't know.
Well, it's because Boris keeps adding in bits and wanting to have
or taking bits out.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm expecting it much later in the week. So,
well, because hopefully it'll be closer to your big read.
There's an element of that about my.
How far had you got in last week's big read before it all blew up on Friday?
I'd made a lot of calls, but anyone who knows me knows I hadn't written a word. So then it blew up, and that was a very fun and intensive 24 hours.
But there was lots of good stuff in there.
Well, there's lots of good stuff, and also, that's effectively writing the new final chapter of my book. So,
my favourite bit in your piece was that Boris Johnson is a victim of a plot to reverse Brexit being led by Dominic Cummings. My favourite of all of the claims from friends of Boris Johnson. Anyway, Louise, lovely to speak to you. Louise McIntosh from Printing Progress in London and Ellis Slater from First Colour Printers. Both very similar in price if you are looking to get any printing done, if anyone is listed for the House of Parliament. Isabel Hardman, lovely to see you. Thanks for coming and doing PMQs. Isabel's, of course, from Spectator. Patrick Maguire, you're doing the PMQs Unpacked email this afternoon?
Yeah, I reckon I can get it out for 2 o'clock. 1:30.
Do you?
Oh,
yeah.
well, that's undermining.
That's undermining Lara.
No, I'm joking. I'm joking.
For 3 o'clock. Go and do what Lara does. Have a nice big lunch. I'll see if she's listening.
I do that every day.
Lovely to see you all. Very good. We'll do PMQs Unpacked same time next week. Up next, we're going to find out about the village, which just lost 2 pubs in a week. Sounds terrible. We'll do that next on Times Radio.
Carol Walker on Times Radio. Essential news.
Millions on jobless benefits do not have to seek work. What's going on?
Alongside a world-class lineup of guests, experts and contributors.
A real concern right now for the government, one of their main